Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. My guest today is Bart Ehrman, the great biblical scholar and historian, in conjunction with his seminar he's putting on a few days from now, the day we release this on November 27th. You have time to get the early bird special to sign up for his live seminar called Did the Christmas Story Really Happen? The Birth of Jesus in History and Legend. It goes all day on December 5th from 9:30 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon Eastern Time. You can watch the whole thing online, of course. I'll be doing that as well. Bart will be covering what we can actually know about the birth of Jesus. How can we decide whether he was born in Bethlehem? Is it possible to reconcile the different gospel accounts? Was the story of the virgin birth a later fabrication? What is the evidence for or against the many details, such as the trip to Bethlehem, the visit of the wisemen, and the slaughter of the innocents? How many of the most familiar parts of the stories come from later legends, and much more. So in this conversation with Bart, we just spent a few minutes on that because I didn't want him to give away the whole seminar here, just on my podcast. So, and I'm very much interested in some of the larger questions, like how do we know Jesus actually existed? That's good evidence for that. Okay, what about his crucifixion? What about the resurrection? What about that he died for our sins? So Bart and I kind of drill through all those and dig down into what those mean and how Christian theologians in the past and Christians today tangle with those kinds of deep issues. Why the virgin birth? Why is that so important to Christians? Well, all right, there's a historical context for that. Same thing with the resurrection story and other stories of miracles, what the context was in the ancient Roman world for why that was important to the early Christians. And then we also discussed the triumph of Christianity, that is the incredible rise from just a handful of followers at Jesus' time of his death to 2.5 billion people today. How does that happen? And so Bart kind of walks us through how that happened both historically and why, just statistically, you only need a tiny growth rate to get something like that happening cumulatively, like compound interest. And then we wrap up talking about the problem of evil, which to me and to Bart also is the biggest problem with all of Christianity, is that, why does an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God allow suffering, tsunamis, childhood leukemia, and so forth. And so we kind of go through the various arguments presented for why that's not a problem and then why we do think it is a problem. So at any rate, do sign up for the seminar on December 5th. You can do so by clicking on the link below. And also check out Bart's many books that I'll put in the biography below for him, and his great courses, Wondrium teaching company courses on all these different topics. I've taken most of his courses and read most of his books, and I find them absolutely fascinating. All right, thanks for listening, and here's our conversation between myself and Bart Ehrman. All right, Bart Ehrman, you are back. You're the first person to be on the show 3 times, so we'll call you our returning champion.
Oh my God! Okay, yes. I want a bigger prize.
That's right. We're going to go to the double Jeopardy round here. So just to alert our listeners, we are recording this on Monday, the 22nd of November. This will be released on the 27th because on December 5th, you are putting on a live seminar that goes all day, 9:30 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon Eastern Time. And we will provide a link below where you could register for this. Because if you register today or tomorrow, that is Saturday or Sunday, you get the early bird discount of $39.95 instead of the $49.95, or $50 for the all-day seminar. So tell us what this is something new for you, right? I mean, you've written a dozen books, you've done a bunch of different teaching company courses, and now you're venturing into putting on live seminars. It's sort of a post-pandemic new trend, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah, I know it's funny. I mean, nobody wants to talk really about silver linings about the pandemic. So,
Yeah.
given that, a lot of places have realized that there are opportunities that we simply didn't have before because most of us were very, very nervous about technology. Zoom was a 4-letter word. Now, Zoom's all we do. And so, so the idea of this webinar, it's going to be an all-day thing. I've done a lot of these things for other organizations. Like for example, for the Smithsonian Associates, I'll do a 4 lecture all day seminar either live in Washington or I've done them remotely as well. And so my idea was just to do it without the middle person, just to do. I mean, it's the same thing. It's just that the Smithsonian's not involved, and people I can now reach out to a different group of people. And so it'll be 4 lectures. It's going to be on the topic: did the Christmas story really happen? And so it's a setup for the Christmas season, and to discuss what we can say and is legendary, and what's legendary in the accounts that we all know, and what could there be any historical basis for any of it? We're not.
Yeah. Yeah. So the subtitle,
So it'll be 4 lectures, as I said.
yeah, the subtitle is the
Yeah.
birth of Jesus in history and legend. So let's just start there. How do you think about the difference between, say, empirical truths that I would include as historical truths, like Jesus probably really did exist and here's the evidence for it? That's a claim we can test, versus legends or mythic truths, truths that aren't, whether they're true or not is irrelevant. It's the meaning of the message or the moral homily or something like that. Particularly not only in our context today, but would they have thought of it in the same way we would have, say, 2,000 years ago?
Ah, yeah, that's a more complicated question, um, because we do differentiate today between what we can establish historically based on historical criteria, not just about Jesus, of course, but about anything in the past. I mean, Abraham Lincoln or Charlemagne, whatever. And we have criteria that we follow as historians to know what probably happened and what are later legendary accretions. Um, it's a very good question. What did ancient people think? Ancient people certainly had the idea of stories about historical figures that were not historically accurate, that are meant to be stories. So they had the idea of stories. But they had a very different kind of attitude toward what we would call fiction. They didn't actually have a word that's like our word fiction. Um, they did have in Greek at least, they had a term mythos, which what comes down to us as the word myth, but it didn't actually mean quite what we mean by myth. Myth really just meant kind of pretty much what we think of as a story. Um, Often, though, it'd be a story that didn't have any historical basis, but it was trying to convey some kind of truth. My sense is that the early Christians did not understand these stories about Jesus as being that kind of thing, being fictional accounts that are meant to convey truths. I think they, uh, so far as we can tell, based on everything everyone has said about it from the ancient world, it looks like they thought these things really happened. And so they would have classified those in the category that we ourselves would call historical.
So they would have seen Jesus of Nazareth in the same light as Pontius Pilate, a real person who really lived and did certain things.
Oh, absolutely. And not, and, and even when you recount miraculous events, they would have seen those as things that happened. They didn't have a problem with they, there were issues about the stories of miracles in the ancient world. People did have questions about miracles, but it wasn't our set of questions. Our questions are always, you know, could miracles happen? Well, no. Maybe people say no, they can't happen, and therefore a miracle story didn't happen. And that was never ever really the view in the ancient world. The question in the ancient world was okay, given the fact that lots of miracles happen, did this one happen? And so all of life is kind of understood to be a miracle. And so there was no inherent problem with miracle. It's just which miraculous things that allegedly happened really did happen.
Yeah, this sort of reminds me of back in the 90s, there was a controversy over this book, Black Athena, about to what extent the Greeks stole Western philosophy from African sources, namely Egypt. And then the question became, were the Egypts black? And anyway, it's a big, long book, and I'm unfairly characterizing it, but Mary Lefkowitz, the classicist, said, that's the sort of question a 1990s American would ask, not somebody that lived in ancient Egypt. Like, what color are we, and why is this important?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's based on all sorts of race. It's based on race theories that developed in the 19th century, and I think she's right about that. What we think of as a race issue simply wasn't ever a race issue. I mean, even within Christianity itself, apart from sort of a lot of very interesting work that's more speculative, but Saint Augustine, he came from North Africa, and so by our standards, he would have been a black man, and people don't think about it like that, but And they in the ancient today we don't think about it because everybody assumes Augustine must have been a white guy, but in the ancient world it was never an issue.
Yeah, it's like the what Jesus looked like. Well, he would have been, a Semitic, Middle Eastern looking, I don't know, kind of swarthy, dark hair, whatever. But in the these paintings you get, he looks like one of the Bee Gees. How did that happen?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I used to tell my students back when they knew who this was that that Jesus didn't look like a California surfer. He looked like Yasser Arafat.
Right,
I mean,
right, right,
that's he's just
right. Yeah, that sort of long blonde hair with blue eyes. Yeah. So there's no question in your mind that there is some debate about whether Jesus existed or not, and I know you've engaged with some of the no Jesus people that think that. What is the evidence we have that he really existed?
yeah. I got to tell you, there are a few things that kind of pull my strings and push my buttons, and that this is one of them.
Yeah,
Because I actually agree with the mythicists uh, in terms of what they're to some extent about what they're trying to achieve, which is to show that the Christian story, in fact, is not rooted. Much of the Christian story is not rooted in what we would consider to be historical fact. But I think they take it so far that it just gets to a point where it's ridiculous. And so this really is a button issue for me. And not because I'm a Christian, obviously, because I'm not. And I would have it wouldn't affect my life at all if Jesus didn't exist. So it really wouldn't affect my life a bit. But I just think, I think we really need to, if we're going to talk about historical figures, we need to apply historical criteria and not simply advance views that would be convenient to our own belief system, our own ideologies. I think, doing history, we had to do history. So what evidence is there? Well, I mean, how much evidence does somebody need? I mean, we have four biographies of this man. I mean, yeah, they're 30, 40, 50 years later, but how many biographies do we have of people living in the first century?
yeah. How many?
For 99.99%, like zero, no buyer. And we got four of them. And the thing is, these four are not just they're not people sitting down writing like ideas that they have in their head. They're based on earlier sources. So this can be clearly demonstrated that these gospels are writing based on written sources that were earlier than them, that were all based on oral sources that preceded them. And when you start adding up the independent sources that were not collaborating with each other, just independent sources that talk about Jesus in very similar terms, it's a large number, and it's the idea that he got invented just would I mean that would be a miracle.
Right.
And in addition to that, we have one writer who actually knows Jesus' brother, and knows his closest disciple, personally knows them and writes about it. So it's not Paul's not an eyewitness, but I mean, he knows his brother.
Right. Right.
So I don't know. I get a little frustrated because I think that as admirable as some of the intention is, I think Methodists basically are shooting themselves in the foot because they convince those who want to be convinced, and the people they really ought to be trying to convince just laugh at them. Are you kidding me? Jesus didn't. I mean, they literally laugh at them, and they don't like to hear that. But it's I talk to people all the time when they hear this, they just start laughing. Scholars, non-scholars, just like
Yeah.
come on.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
if you want to show the problems of the historical Jesus, that's not the way to go, in my opinion.
Right, right. Yeah, sometimes I know who some of these people are. The sense I get is they just want to poke the hornet's nest and say, you see, Christians, your guy didn't even exist. So, okay, so he probably existed. Okay, good. And he was probably crucified. I mean, the Romans crucified everybody for anything, right? So that's not an extraordinary claim. So I think that needs only ordinary evidence. But
Yeah,
when you move up to, say, the resurrection, no. So first of all, there's other things like he died for your sins. Well, that's not a question that you and I could answer. It's just, you either believe it or you don't. It's kind of just a religious doctrine as part of being a Catholic or a Protestant or
yeah.
Baptist or whatever. But the raised from the dead, I mean, that it could have happened. He could have been the one and only, and all the others were fake or not. So how do you think about the resurrection in between those two mythic truths and empirical truths?
Well, I don't think that there's any way that you can marshal evidence for the resurrection. By historians can only establish the probabilities of what happened in the past. By definition, that's what historians do. Lincoln probably wrote the Gettysburg Address on an envelope, but it might have been a spare sheet of paper lying around. I don't know. I mean, but you have to you try to establish what probably happened with everybody. Julius Caesar. I mean, just name your person. And so the difficulty is that resurrections, by definition, are not probable. You can have a near-death experience. That happens. But the idea that somebody dies and they are raised from the dead, never to die anymore and to be taken up into heaven. If there are 7 billion people in the world now, for how many of those people is that going to happen? Well, 0. Suppose there's one person in the history of the universe that's happened to. Well, okay, so what are they? What you just count up the odds. What are the odds? Well, okay, 1 in 50 billion or something.
I put it at 100 billion to 1.
It's just not probable.
Yeah.
Okay, 100 billion to 1. So what's the probability that some other explanation can account for things? That, for example, some explanation that the disciples believed they saw Jesus afterwards. Well, 1 out of 8 people in our country believes or will believe that they have seen a dead relative after the person's been buried. 1 out of 8. And they really believe it. When that happens to you, when your grandmother shows up in your bedroom 2 weeks later, you really think she's appeared to you. I mean, she's like, and so what would be the chances of somebody thinking that a deceased beloved one appeared to them? Well, 1 out of 8 versus 1 out of 100 billion. So if you're doing history and you're just trying to establish probabilities, so there are lots of other explanations, of course, for the resurrection appearances and I don't think you can establish it historically. That's not to say it didn't happen. Christians think it happened, and there's no way to prove it or disprove it. But it's not based on evidence; it's based on faith.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm fond of telling this story, so apologies to my listeners for hearing it again. But at this conference I was at with Richard Dawkins and Ken Miller, the biologist who was supremely excellent at debunking the intelligent design creationist arguments about the structure of the cell. And anyway, he wrote this book explaining why the creationists are wrong and why the evolution theory accounts for all these things. And then, but in the last chapter, he has this, by the way, I'm a Catholic, and here's all the things I believe. So at this conference, Richard kind of pushes him on this and says, all right, so Jesus was supposedly born of a virgin. Let's say we found a piece of the true cross, and there was a little bit of flesh on there. We could extract the DNA from Jesus. Would he have the full complement of DNA like the rest of us have, or would he have something weird because he was fathered by the deity or whatever? But and Ken could see where this was going, and he just stops and said, Richard, I'm not claiming this is true in any scientific sense. I'm a Catholic. This is what we believe. Full stop. And it's like, okay, there's really nowhere to go from there. It's like, okay, that's
right. Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, the problem is with Christian apologists who want to defend the faith by arguing for it and it's a strange situation, but you have Roman Catholic apologists and you have Protestant apologists, and they have this notion that you can prove claims of faith. You can prove the resurrection, you can prove the inerrancy of the Bible, you can prove the existence of God. And the oddity is that these people are more children of the Enlightenment than most university professors. Because university professors gave up a long time ago trying to prove stuff like this. But, if you believe in objectivity, this is completely an Enlightenment project. And so it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. The last people on earth you would expect to be Enlightenment people are, these people arguing for miracles.
Yeah. Well, so what you mean there is that you're supposed to have evidence for your beliefs, not just I believe it just because my parents believed, or my culture, or my friends, or my religion, and so I just do what I'm told. No, the Enlightenment says, no, you got to have reasons. All right, so what are your reasons? And you've engaged these people. Here's the 6 reasons we think Jesus really died, or the Bible is inerrant, or whatever, and they'll debate it to the earth's end, just like flat earthers do, or any conspiracy theorists. They mostly have a whole series of arguments. Nobody thinks, I'm a pseudoscientist, or I'm a quack, or I'm just making stuff up. People think they have good reasons for their belief. And that's what you mean by the Enlightenment project.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because, obviously before the Enlightenment, people had reasons, but the reasons were set up differently. Like you'd have theological reasons. but what they're doing is they're claiming secular, historical, and scientific evidence. For a young Earth, for example, they're going to cite scientific evidence, or intelligent design, or the resurrection of Jesus. Any these are objective facts, and the best way to explain these objective facts is Jesus really was raised from the dead. Whoa, yeah, there are very big problems with that line of argument.
So, but if you go back to, say, Thomas Aquinas and his Summa Theologica, where he presents these kind of rational arguments or logical arguments for God's existence, what was the intention of this? Just to kind of reinforce this is why we believe what we believe, or to prove it to skeptics, or what?
Not so much to prove it to skeptics. I think in Thomas Aquinas' day, of course, it was really to support people and to provide them with ways of thinking about the divine that were more sophisticated than simply accepting it because your mom and dad told you so. But that there's actually, that Christian thinkers have always been interested in getting Christians to think, and so that it was more that kind of thing. Um, just as today, a lot of these apologists who are trying to prove the resurrection or prove the Bible's inerrant really are not trying to prove it to non-believers. That's the pretense, but that's not really what's going on. When they write a book on this material, it's not directed toward non-believers. It's directed to believers to give them ammunition and to make them feel good about what they think. Um, and so that's why they rarely convince anybody else, and they know that.
Well, this is a good time to kind of review your own personal history, which I always loved, and we'll have properly introduced you in the video that introduces this episode. But I love your story because you were a believer, and then you went to Bible school, and then you went to an actual real theological institute, and then you came out the other end rather differently in your thinking.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think one of the reasons I get invited to debate these fundamentalist apologists is because they know I used to be one of them, and
Right.
so I would, I believed I could prove the resurrection. I had the arguments, and I knew all this, and so I went to Moody Bible Institute, which is a bastion of fundamentalism, because I was a born again Christian and intent on pursuing my faith and learning everything I could about it. Became fanatical about it, and I no, one level I don't regret that because if I hadn't gone that route, I would never have become a scholar. Never, never, ever. Nobody in high school thought I'd become a scholar, but became a scholar through the back door because I got so invested in the Bible. I just developed these study habits and these work habits. And the brain's like this muscle. You're working hard enough, pretty soon, even though like you don't have much there, you start bulking up. And so, I don't regret that. But I was very committed to this fundamentalist cause. And it really was when when I went to do my master's program at Princeton Theological Seminary that I started rethinking things. My professors were not fundamentalists, and they had different views that I rejected outright. But then the more I studied it, I decided, look, I at least have to see whether there's evidence for what they're saying. And after a while, I started realizing, oh my God, I didn't become a non-Christian at all. I became, Princeton Theological Seminary is not a fundamentalist school. It's a liberal Presbyterian school, and I became a fairly liberal Christian and was that for many years. And it was, as you know, it wasn't my biblical scholarship that led me away from the faith in the end. It was unrelated things. It had to do with why there's suffering in the world, whether you can explain that. There's a God who's in charge.
Right. Yep, that's a good story, and you wrote a whole book about that. I think let's just spend 5 minutes on what the content of your seminar on the Christmas story. I don't want you to give too much away, then people won't want to take the seminar. So just kind of give us what do we actually know about the birth of Jesus, and was he born in Bethlehem, and what about the virgin birth, and is there evidence
Yeah,
for details like the trip to Bethlehem and so on, and was he really born on December 25th?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, right. Snow falling all around, the Christmas trees up, is all the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Right. So the way I'm setting this up is I'm going to be dealing with some of the important issues, and there's some things that people are fairly familiar. obviously there are a whole range of people some people have no idea about any of this. Some people know it all intimately. And so it's going to be a little tricky because you've got to deal with things. But, I mean, I think a lot of general readers, and certainly my undergraduate students, don't know that the birth of Jesus, the Christmas story, is only found in 2 of the books of the New Testament out of the 27. And it's kind of interesting because the virgin birth is found in both Matthew and Luke. It's not found in Mark. He doesn't say anything about it. Not found in John. He doesn't say anything about it. Well, that's intriguing. Seems like a kind of important point.
Yeah.
If you knew about it, wouldn't you mention it? And Paul doesn't say anything about it, and a lot in my part of the world, in the South, there are a lot of churches that say if you do not believe in the literal virgin birth of Jesus, then you cannot be a Christian.
Really?
And I think it's an interesting claim because does it mean that Paul wasn't a Christian?
Hmm.
Because if he knew about it, So anyway, so I'm dealing with things on a number of levels. One will be things that many people don't know. Some will be things that most people don't know. And some things will be things that people know. But um, we have these 2 stories in the New Testament, and there are only canonical accounts of Jesus' birth. And one kind of standard question is, do they agree with each other? What Matthew says, what Luke says, are they simpatico? The Christmas story we tell every year takes Matthew and Luke and puts them together and comes up with a big story where everything that happens in Matthew and Luke come together. But if you separate them and ask, if Matthew's right that this happened, can Luke really be right that that happened? How's that work exactly? And so there'll be a lot of that kind of thing. And there'll be discussions about, can historians talk about things like a virgin birth? Historians can certainly talk about whether Jesus was born in Bethlehem or not. And it turns out that there are some interesting historical arguments against it. That even even some Roman Catholic biblical scholars have said, yeah, he probably wasn't born in Bethlehem. I mean, like priests who are like active biblical scholars, because there's good reasons for thinking not. And so I'll be talking about some of that kind of thing. I'll also be getting into stories that are not found in the New Testament. There's some really interesting that most people don't know about, interesting accounts outside the New Testament involving Jesus' birth. One of them claims to be written by Jesus' brother, James. That's interesting. And another account of Jesus as a young boy that I'll probably get into. As a 5-year-old boy, there's an account written by another brother of his, Judas, Thomas,
Oh,
who's
wow.
supposed to be his twin brother.
Oh, my God.
What? And so, yeah, and so there's that thing. And the interesting thing is that some of these other stories had a huge impact on Christian thinking. Even though today people don't read them, but these stories by Jesus' twin brother, Thomas, one of them made it into the Quran.
Oh, wow. Oh, my God. I didn't know that.
Weirdly. And yeah. And a number of them really influenced Christians through the Middle Ages down to today. So that, for example, you know how in all those medieval and Renaissance paintings, when you've got Jesus is born, you got Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, and Joseph's an old man. What's that about? Yeah, well, that comes from this gospel allegedly written by Jesus' brother James, and it's a full account of why he's an old man. And
Wow.
so stuff like
Wow.
that. So I'm going to be dealing with. I've
Yeah.
got 4 lectures. It's going to be on all these kinds of things, and it's going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot of fun. And by the way, people are going to have a chance to ask questions.
Oh,
So
good.
after each of these 4 lectures, I'm going to have a question and answer session. So people who are there be able to do that too.
Yeah. So if I recall, Mark is the first gospel that was written, and the others are a decade or 2 after Mark. So if Mark doesn't mention the virgin birth, how do you think about the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, or it's just he forgot, or or it wasn't important to him?
Yeah, well, it could be no, right. Yeah, yeah. I don't think that the fact that he doesn't mention it is not a persuasive argument that he didn't know about it. But I would say it is interesting and worth considering. Did he know about it? What makes it a little bit more interesting is that in chapter 2 of Mark, Jesus is teaching. So he's an adult now. He's teaching. He starts out as an adult in Mark. He's teaching these crowds, and he's got these crowds around him, and he's been doing these. He's been casting out demons and things. And it says that his mother and his brothers came to take him out of the public view because they thought he had gone out of his mind. His
Interesting.
mother
Wow.
didn't understand that he was doing miracles, thought he'd gone crazy.
Whoa.
That seems to be unlikely if she knew that he was born of a virgin.
Right.
She was his mother. And so it's not just that he's not mentioned. It's like there are other things that make you think, it doesn't sound like he knows about it. And in the Gospel of John, also there's something kind of like that. It's different, but it's in the Gospel of John. Jesus, there's no mention of the virgin birth, the Gospel of John at all. But at one point, Jesus' enemies are upset with him about something, and they're having an argument, and they're trying to kind of dig it in. They use this ad hominem argument, that's irrelevant to the point, but like it's kind of take a dig at him personally. And they say, we were not born illegitimately. Yeah.
Interesting.
We weren't born out of wedlock, in other words. And it's like, what does that suggest about what they think? There are other rumors, that Jesus' mother, in fact, got pregnant by a Roman soldier, or that there's some kind of thing going on. And maybe John knows about that, but doesn't know about. So anyway, so there are other things. It's not just the absence of evidence.
I forget which comedian had a riff on that, where she fools around with some guy, gets pregnant, and tells her husband, let's see, God did it. Oh, okay.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But in one of your courses, I think it was one of your teaching company great courses, where you talk about the kind of the context of the time, where it was not unusual for gods to come down and interact with humans and have sex with them, and vice versa, and people can become gods, or gods can become human. So that wouldn't have been that out of context at that time.
No, the idea that a god gets a mortal pregnant is found. You get it in Greek mythology, you get it in Roman mythology. It's a common trope in the ancient world. The difference in this case is that depending on how you read it, in these other cases, the women are not virgins. I mean, they really have sex. They have some of these accounts are rather graphic about how much sex they have with these gods. And so like there's physical union taking place. And except for one hint in the book of Luke, it sounds like there's no physical contact involved. She's still a virgin. One of these other stories, the one that outside the New Testament, written by Jesus, allegedly written by Jesus' brother James, goes on to show that not only did she conceive as a virgin, when Jesus was born, her hymen still hadn't broken. She was still a virgin. That was the definition of virgin in the ancient world. And it's a very interesting story where right after Jesus is born, a midwife but doesn't believe that she's a virgin, and she gives Mary an internal exam to see if the hymen's still intact. This is described in this gospel.
Oh my God!
And it's like, whoa! And it turns out, she's still a virgin. Oh my God!
And therefore, the obvious question is, then how did it happen? Cesarean?
It's a miracle.
It's a miracle. Yeah.
I don't know.
I guess that's the point, right? It's to establish Jesus as somebody more than just another one of these Greek gods or Roman gods. He stands apart from all of them.
Yeah, it's one-upping it. Yeah, it's one-upping it.
Yeah, and so it comes down to us, as this super miracle that's never happened before. I mean, Christians often make the argument that this religion is unique. There's nothing quite like it. And, when I read your books, it's like, well, no, not really. I mean, there's the particular concatenation of all the stories, and of course, that's unique. But the elements are all there elsewhere. Virgin births, flood myths.
The elements are there, and you get. For Jesus, you have accounts of people who are born miraculously from a god and a human. People who are young wunderkind when it comes to religious things, who wow the teachers, who go on itinerant preaching ministries, who tell parables, and who cast out demons and heal the sick, and at the end of their life they ascend to heaven. I mean, we have other stories like this. So when people say like it's completely unique, it's just because they haven't read very much.
Right.
You have to read. You have to do some reading to know what ancient people said.
One of the arguments I make about the resurrection is if the evidence was so compelling, why don't Jews and Muslims believe it? And you can't just say, well, they don't understand the arguments. If they read my book, then they'd be Christians. It's like, no, these rabbis and these imams, they're smart people. They're well read. They know the arguments. They just don't accept the arguments. So why don't Jews and Muslims accept Jesus as the Messiah?
Well, it's easier to answer for Jews, I think, because there's a very big problem for Jews, which is that Jews had not set. Jews had a certain range of expectations of what a Messiah figure would be, um, and Jesus ran completely contrary to all the expectations. And so, Christians, especially conservative Christians, talk about how Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies. In fact, it's not right. I mean, the when Jews, most Jews were not expecting a Messiah any more than most people Jews today are. I mean, my next door neighbor is not expecting a Messiah to come next week. I mean, they got other things on their mind, and it was like that in the ancient world too. But those who did have some expectation that there'd be a Messiah figure thought that this would be some figure of power who destroyed the enemy, either a supernatural warrior or a great hero of Israel who would drive out the Romans and set up a kingdom in Jerusalem. And Christians started saying that this man who was crucified for crimes against the state is the Messiah. And Jews said, "What?" I mean, it's like, so I can't use this illustration anymore with my students. But what I used to say, it's like me really telling you, I think David Koresh is the Lord of the universe.
Right.
What?
Right.
The guy who got killed in the FBI raid in Waco, he's the Lord of the universe. You nuts? No, that's what I think.
Right.
So it just doesn't convince anybody. And so, and by the time Islam came along, it was 6 centuries later. It was a whole different ball game, and they weren't about to kind of openly consider the Christian claims because they had their own thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So let's just hit some of the other highlights here of from your work, because I know you're limited on time, and I want to watch that. It was the triumph of Christianity. I think that's what you were on the show for the last time, right? So how does an itinerant preacher who his handful of followers go, this guy's the Messiah, Son of God, and everybody's going, you're out of your mind. All right, how do you go from that to 2.5 billion followers today?
I know. Yeah, I know. It's quite a story. And that is what my book is about, The Triumph of Christianity, which, by the way, it just came out as a great courses. It just came out a few weeks ago. I did a great courses
on
nice. And on the same thing. I think it's really, really interesting stuff because such a huge, it's a huge historical issue. You talk about a big historical issue. If Christianity had not taken over the Roman Empire, the entire history of the West would have been completely different. It would have there would have been some kind of history, but we wouldn't have. I mean, you just think about Western art or Western music or Western philosophy, and none of this. There wouldn't have been anything like it. And so, it might have been better, it might have been worse. I don't know, but not to mention social policy, politics. I mean, God, it's unbelievable. So the question is, how did it happen? And that's what my book is about. Is that you start out with this unknown preacher from a rural backwater of Galilee who spoke Aramaic, had a few followers, to becoming within 300 years, there were millions of these people, and by the end of the 4th century, it's half of the Roman Empire and the official religion of the Roman Empire, and then it becomes the religion of the entire West until now. Basically, I mean, it's not official, but it's the biggest. So. What I try to argue, yeah, it's a long argument.
But if I recall,
followers of Jesus who believe.
Don't you show you had some calculations in the book that you don't need a big growth rate, just like a 1% growth rate. Like in economics, if you have a small investment and you just let it sit and accumulate for decades, pretty soon you have a big payoff at the end. Compound. It's like compound interest of conversion. You don't need many.
Interest.
Yeah.
Well, if in technical terms, that's what technically that's what happens. It's an exponential curve, and so it's like your investments. Hopefully, it's like your investments. And so the way it works is that if you um, if you got $100, and you invest it and get 1% on it, okay, you make $1. That's nice. But if you've got $100 million and you get 1%, it's a lot of bucks. And over time, like it starts growing exponentially. And so the thing about Christianity that made it distinctive in the Roman world there were two things actually. There are thousands of religions in the Roman world, but none of them was missionary. None of them was really working hard to get converts. Even Judaism just was not interested in making people agree with them. And the reason was because of the second thing. Christianity was the only religion that was exclusive, that said we're right and therefore you're wrong. Now, Jews had that view about their own religions. They thought, well, we're worshiping our God, you do your own thing. But it wasn't that like you're wrong and going to go to hell. For most Jews, there wasn't an afterlife. It's just this, we're the people of God. This is our custom. This is how we want to live. And so just leave us alone, please. Whereas Christians said, we've got the truth, and Jesus is the one way of salvation. He died for our sins. And if you don't accept his death, then you'll still be in your sin. So you've got to accept Jesus, or you're going to roast in hell. And so they're exclusive, and they're the other one's exclusive, and they're missionary. But it means that if they just convert, if you've got 100 people, Christians, and they convert 3 people this year, okay, well now you got 103. And then the next year, you do that year after year after year. And every time you convert somebody, you're taking them away from the other religions. And you're the only religion doing it. And so over 300 years, you need about a growth rate of about 30 or 35% every decade, a decade. And so it's 100 of you need to convert about 3 people a year.
That's lower than the stock market. And the stock market is pretty spectacular over the last century. So that would explain how you get hundreds of millions and then a billion and so on, just cumulative. Right. This idea of Jesus as a moral philosopher. How do you think about the break between the Old Testament and the New Testament? And Jesus was kind of a nascent feminist, and he was his God, that the God of the New Testament was kinder, gentler than the Old Testament God, and so forth. And that it was kind of a break, and that even secularists like me could say, well, I acknowledge Jesus was a great moral philosopher or teacher or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I think I've got several thoughts about that. I write a book now on the Book of Revelation, and how the Book of Revelation, what it's really all about. And for a long time, I've been sort of taken aback by Christians, non-Christian people. Generally, you have this idea that the Old Testament is a God of wrath, and the New Testament God is a God of love. And when people tell me that, I ask them, have you ever read the Book of Revelation? It's in the New Testament. You talk about wrath. Oh my God. He's not destroying the city of Jericho. He's destroying the world. It's like really significant. But one of the things I'm doing in this book I'm writing, it's a popular book for a trade, general audience. Yeah. I'm actually talking about the comparison of that Revelation view of God with Jesus' own view of God. And I think that Jesus did not invent the idea that you should love your neighbor as yourself. That's just a quotation from the book of Leviticus. It's the Old Testament law that says that. But I do think that was the guiding dictate for Jesus' understanding and his understanding of salvation. That salvation comes to people who follow what God wants, which means you treat other people well and you help those in need. And there are passages that I think Jesus really said in the New Testament, where even people who are not Jewish, if they help others in need, they're going to be welcomed into God's kingdom. And the schmucks out there, even if they're Jewish, forget it. You're going to be cast out. Being Jewish isn't going to help. But it's not based on belief in my death and resurrection. It's based on how do you live? You treat other people well or not. And I think that's contrary to the book of Revelation. I think Revelation is all about you've got to believe in Jesus or forget it. You're going to be destroyed.
Yeah, interesting, because that's the last book of the Bible, so it's almost putting an end cap on it, saying, here's the final message.
Yeah.
You better believe or else.
Yeah. Exclamation mark.
Boom.
Yeah. That's it.
That's funny. I
Yeah.
can't wait to read that book.
Boom. Yeah. Lowers the boom.
How do Christians deal with the problem of identity? How can God be also Jesus and the Son of Man, and the Son of God is
Ah.
God, and so and the Holy Spirit, so
Yeah.
it's a Trinity, and
Yeah.
this Unitarians versus
Yeah.
Trinitarians, and it's like if you just
Yeah.
summarize it
Yeah.
in one sentence, it was like, so God sacrificed Himself to Himself to save us from Himself. I mean, this is what Richard Dawkins would call barking mad in that British saying.
Right. Yeah. Well, Richard wouldn't know this, but that was actually a particular theological view in the 2nd century that got declared a heresy. And so God is not doing this to himself. Yeah. Yeah. That's called modalism. So the idea of modalism. So Christians by the 2nd century, Christians were saying that Jesus is God. They were also saying God is God. And they're saying the Holy Spirit is God. And they were saying the three of them are all God, and there's only one God. And so that's the doctrine of the Trinity. It's not. It's not that there's one. So there are three. There are actually three separate persons, three individuals that are all God. They're all equally God, but there's only one God. And of course, that doesn't add up, and it's not meant to add up. It's meant to be a paradox and a mystery within Christian theology. But the heresy in the 2nd century is what Richard was describing. Modalism says that they're trying to figure it out. Like, how can Christ be God if God's God and Spirit's God? But we got one God. How's that work? And the way they did it, the way these modalists did it, is they said, look, the way I put it for myself is, at the same time, I am a son, and I am a father, and I'm a brother. There's only one of me, but I'm in three different relationships, and God's like that. In kind of, sometimes he's acting like a father, sometimes like the son, sometimes like the spirit, and it depends what mode he's in relationship with you in. And so there's only one in three modes. That was declared a heresy because, well, for a variety of reasons. Some of the opponents of that pointed out just what Richard was saying, that it means that the Father got crucified.
Right.
The Father, God, the Father got crucified. What? And so they called this. The person who came up with this was this church theologian called Tertullian. His name is Tertullian. He called this view patripassionism. Patrip, which means the Father suffers, and so he meant it as a kind of a mocking it. But so that view didn't win out, but also the view that there are three separate gods didn't win out, because you can't have that. We're monotheists. And so they end up with this kind of this Trinity mystery thing where you got three persons but only one God.
The Unitarians are really not that different from Trinitarians. They're just it's just a matter of how they talk about the problem of identity and relationships and everything you just said.
Yeah, I don't know if all Unitarians have the same views about this, because there've been a lot of views over the years. I think my sense, I'm not an expert on Unitarianism, but the ones I know have, a lot of them have very fuzzy views about all of this. But there have been other views that were very popular. They still, I think, are popular, even among people who might claim to believe in the Trinity. They don't really understand that the three have to be equal. I think most people think the Father's like the top dog, and that Christ is the secondary level, and the Spirit's below that. And that's that. So there's a kind of there's a hierarchy, and that's perfectly fine. And you could certainly use the Bible to support that view, because the Bible doesn't deal with these issues. But the Trinitarian view is the other one.
Right.
So Unitarian, insists there's one God. And I think some think that Jesus is a human, and others think that he's some kind of divine being.
And then, since we're all born in sin, why do I need to accept Christ as my Savior to be forgiven for the original sin? Why can't God just forgive me? Why do we need the middleman and the sacrifice?
Yeah. Well, I know, there are a lot of course, there are a lot of theologians who are not fundamentalists. and very, very sophisticated theologians who teach at places like Harvard and Yale, who are not, you know, they're they are not like hard. they they're very intellectual, philosophically trained human beings who are, I mean, deeply philosophical in the regular philosophical traditions, who will regularly say that the doctrine of the atonement is the biggest problem with Christianity.
Really?
And why does Christ have to die? Yeah, yeah. I mean, like they can't explain it. They know all the explanations, of course. Going back to, I mean, you mentioned Aquinas, and I mean, there are all these explanations. Going back to Anselm, it's like you have all of these explanations, but the reality is that it's a bit of an embarrassment for a lot of theologians because, when my son does something wrong, when he disobeys me, I don't tell him that I have to kill his cat now to forgive him. I'm sorry, you got this cat here, and somebody's got to die, so I'll take the cat instead of you. So I kill this cat. It's like, what? No, like, why can't you just say, okay, sorry, yeah, okay, okay, I forgive you. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like something, or if it's a test, it just let's see how committed you really are to this particular religion. You have to actually
yeah,
make this leap of faith and accept Jesus as your Savior. John 3:16,
yeah,
it's posted at every football game.
yeah,
So God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son, and so on.
yeah, yeah. I think what happened. I mean, I think historically, to answer your question, the way it worked was it didn't work that you had an idea and saw it being fulfilled. What happened was they came to think that Jesus was raised from the dead. Their teacher who'd been around, and they loved him, they adored him, they thought maybe he's the Messiah. He got killed. He's not the Messiah. But then they saw that he was raised. They saw that he was raised from the dead, and it led them to a kind of a series of backwards reasoning. They argued backwards from what they knew. They knew he'd been raised, but then they asked, well, why did he die? I mean, if he got raised, he shows he's under God's special favor. But is this what God does to the people he favors? He has them tortured to death? Why did God do that? So they had to have a reason for God doing that. Well, he must have killed him not because of anything he did. He's the one that God adored. So it must have been he died for other people's sins. And so these are people living in a sacrificial culture, that the way you appease God is by sacrifices. And so if Jesus didn't die because of anything he did wrong, maybe he was a sacrifice. Well, he was a sacrifice, then his sacrifice, somehow you have to accept the sacrifice for yourself. And so you've got to believe in the sacrifice. And so it works backwards to the doctrine of an atonement that's made necessary because Jesus did die and he was God's favorite. And you've got to explain how those two things relate to each other.
Yeah, another thing that always bothered me was this idea that the kind of anti-Semitic trope that the Jews killed our Lord and Savior. Well, first of all, Jesus was Jewish, so I mean, it's not like there were Christians and the Jews wanted to kill the Christians. There were no Christians. And in any case, if this had to
Yeah,
happen
right.
to fulfill the whole story and for you to be saved, he had to die, then you should be thanking the Jews for killing, or the Romans or whoever, for killing Jesus. That was part of the divine plan.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the last point you made is a good one because it's very, very weird. I mean, Pontius Pilate ordered Jesus crucified, and the Roman soldiers crucified him. But it's very weird that the Christian line over the centuries has been the Jews killed Jesus. Why don't they say the Italians killed Jesus? Why don't they? Why isn't there anti-Italian sentiment? Go on a pogrom against the Italians in Rome, wipe them out. What? I mean, it's like it makes no sense.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the Jews. Come on. So, yeah, I know it's part of Christianity is filled with paradoxes, and it's part of in some ways it's the beauty of the religion that it's this weird set of paradoxes. To live you have to die, that death brings life, uh, and that suffering is good, and that suffering now it's like there are all these weird things, the trinity. So this paradox, the idea that Christ is both human and divine, it's a paradox. The idea that Jews are free acting people who have to kill the Messiah. They do kill the Messiah, and then they're blamed for it. Well, why? I mean, it's like they're doing. So it's it's one of the mysteries. They were fated to do it, but they chose to do it. And so they're punished for choosing to do it, even though they were fated. Well, that doesn't make sense. This whole religion is kind of like that, but it's kind of interesting that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and that
it wasn't interesting for Jewish-Christian relations.
No.
I mean, it's horrible for Jewish-Christian. Oh my God! And it got worse because at first, they said, well, you did it, so if you repent, you'll be fine. By the end of the 2nd century, we have one particular Christian author named Melito of Sardis, who argues that Jesus was God, and since the Jews killed him, Jews killed God, and so this is the first charge of deicide. The Jews killed their own God. Oh my God! Oh.
So by the time we get to Martin Luther, who was famously anti-Semitic, that was a pretty old tradition already. He was just reflecting what a lot of people thought.
Oh yeah. No. This was like he inherited all this. This had been going on for years, many centuries.
Right.
And so it's a little bit hard for modern Christians to get their mind around Martin Luther, burning a synagogue filled with Jews. Like, really? But in his context, that wasn't that problematic.
Yeah, so that brings us to
the thing is,
Go ahead. Please go ahead. Please. Oh, I was just going to bring up the problem of evil. Just kind of wrap up our conversation there, because that transitions nicely to that. You wrote a great book, God's Problem: How the Bible Fails to Answer Our Most Important Question, Why We Suffer. So maybe part of the answer is because Jesus suffered, something like that. So that's part of it. Or natural evil, earthquakes, tsunamis, and so on, versus human evil, genocide, homicide, so forth. Theologians make distinctions like that, but still, it just kind of comes down to this simple question, like that the comedian and actor Stephen Fry asked. He was asked, "What would you, if it turns out there's a God, what would you say to him?" And he said, "I would say, what's with childhood leukemia?"
Yeah, me too. I know. I've had several public debates with people who've wanted to argue that problem suffering isn't really a problem with respect to understanding God's purposes in the world. And I just find it very puzzling, especially the natural disasters, the things that, I think free will could explain a lot of things. I don't like you, so I punch you in the mouth, and so knocked out a tooth. Sorry, but I had my free will and I could just choose to, okay, fine. But, natural disasters, I had a debate. I had 3 debates with Dinesh D'Souza.
Oh my God! Right.
On the problem of suffering. Yeah. And he argued. Dinesh he's a very smart guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's really irritating about a lot of things.
Yep.
Those things. But I like him on the personal level. But he argued that the reason we have natural disasters is because God had to create the world that way. And he literally argues that if God had not created the world with tectonic plates, then we wouldn't have had life. And so we have to have the tectonic plates. And the problem with tectonic plates is that gives you tsunamis.
And earthquakes, yeah.
Dinesh, who said that you have to have a world with tectonic plates for life to exist? Well, but that's how life came up. Well, God's all powerful, right? Yeah, well, so you mean he could not create a world without tectonic plates to lead to life? No, he couldn't do that. What do you mean? You think he's all powerful? And so, it makes no sense. And these arguments just strike me as really absurd. And yeah, people have free will, but why do they have to have that much free will? Why do you have enough free will to kill 6 million Jews? Can't there be some limits? There are limits. I can't decide I don't like you and so zap you with a brainwave. So there are limits. Why aren't the limits better than this? So come on.
Yeah, I know Dinesh pretty well too. And here he's grabbing from the scientific pool of explanations for things and then back engineering it into his theology. So the argument is that planets with geological forces at work, like plate tectonics, will give us things like different gradations of ecosystems and maybe tide. So you have to have a moon also that the water comes in and out near the land, and the life maybe forms there. And so you have to have all that kind of Earth-like systems at work, so, which we've only discovered in the last half century of how that all works. And from there, and there's still no consensus on how the origins of life would have begun in the ocean. Say, what holds the molecules together into these protein chains and so forth. But my larger point is Dinesh is just basically backing into it, saying, here's what scientists tell us. Now let's see how we can square this with our theology. It seems to me that the free will issue is also big because most Christians think that miracles do happen. So you'll hear the stories of, oh, I was supposed to be on this plane and then, something distracted me and I didn't go and the plane crashed. So obviously God was looking out after me. Well, why wasn't he looking out after the people on the plane? Because most of them were probably Christians because we're in America. And, what about them?
It's unbelievable how shallow people's thinking is. I mean, that airplane thing just really drives me nuts. But it goes down to kind of very basic, like non-problematic things. Like I prayed and I'm playing quarterback for my football team, and I prayed, and man, I was 12 for 14, and
right.
280 yards. Man, we creamed them. Thank you, God.
Right. Although I suppose they may say, well, I wasn't really petitioning the deity for a victory. I'm thanking him. So prayer, a different kind of prayer where you're just kind of acknowledging the good that God brings in the world.
Well, you get both. I think you get both.
Yeah.
But when I was a fundamentalist Christian, I thought you could petition God and get your parking space.
Right.
And then so you can petition for your parent who has cancer and it doesn't work. Well, God didn't want to give you that one. Well, what's the point of the petition then if he's
picking and choosing?
So,
yeah, there's the idea that another one of Dinish's arguments is God works in mysterious ways, by which they mean God's world is different than our world, and He knows what the end game is going to be, and so this is part of the bigger picture.
Yeah.
But isn't there a way to unfold history in a way that
is always,
that doesn't include a Holocaust? Do we really need the Holocaust as part of the whole story?
I know. And if the answer is that God works in mysterious ways, then the question is always, well, why should I think so? It's possible, sure, it's possible. I mean, there might be a supreme force guiding all this, but what would make you think so? And so.
Yeah, Francis Collins has a discussion.
Some people find enough reason to think so.
Yeah, Francis Collins has a discussion about this in his book, The Language of God, where he deals with the problem of evil, about his daughter. He talks about his daughter being raped as a young woman and how this horrible tragedy led to her, sort of stronger character and developed, a different kind of internal strength to deal with these kinds of things and so forth. But again, to me, that's just kind of backing into it after the fact. Isn't there a way for God to direct people to develop stronger character than horrible tragedies like rape or homicide or genocide or whatever?
I know. Why can't it be a hangnail or something?
That's right.
But I mean, the thing is that, and I was when I did this book,
God's
Problem. I did this book. That was the name of the book on suffering. I was doing a radio interview in Minnesota or someplace, and some pastor was there. We were going to interview the two of us because he's a local guy, and he was actually a good guy, Bart. So he told me that, 2 weeks before he'd been counseling this mother whose 16-year-old daughter had been killed in a car accident. And he went into her home and was talking with her, and she said, I know why this happened. And he said, oh, really? Why? He said, well, I promised God that I would quit smoking. And I didn't do it. And so he took my daughter.
Oh, that's horrible.
What?
Right. God.
What? I mean, what do you even say? It's like, so people come up with these things, people starving to death. I had a debate with, what was that guy's name, this philosopher at Oxford, who we did this radio debate, and he was arguing, you need to look at the good side of the Holocaust.
The good side?
Because because actually, it makes us more noble when we realize that, how precious life is. It's made us more noble. Oh, okay. So 6 million people had to die, so I'd feel better about myself. Great. That's an interesting idea for an Oxford philosopher.
Right. Right. Yeah. I wonder if that was Alistair McGrath. I think I've heard him make that argument. Any case.
No, it wasn't Alistair McGrath. He's a
Oh,
smart guy.
okay.
No, it was, what's that guy's name? I always wipe it out of my head because I just got so angry at the
Yeah.
guy.
Well, I mean, I suppose you could make an argument, a secular argument, like out of the Holocaust came international law against crimes against humanity. The term, genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1945 to describe what happened. And the Nuremberg trials put those kinds of crimes on the map as a notice to future dictators. We're going to try you if you do this kind of thing. And of course, it hasn't completely stopped it, but at least those kinds of events happen at fewer times and at lesser death rates. So maybe there's a little bit of progress there, but that's quite a reach to try to justify the Holocaust as something that was necessary.
That's right. I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's some things that I'm just never going to look at the bright side of, but most kinds of suffering that I experience absolutely have a silver lining. Sometimes they're not good, but you can find things in them. I don't find massive starvation of children in developing countries to have a bright side. There's no silver lining as far as I'm concerned. Just not.
Maybe Rabbi Kushner.
It's been like that.
Rabbi Kushner in his famous book, "When Bad Things Happen to Good People," is that God just can't do it. He's just limited. He just can't stop tsunamis.
Yeah. Well, when I first started thinking seriously about suffering, I was teaching a class at Rutgers on biblical problems of suffering, what the Bible says about it. And I had my students read Kushner's book. And by the end of the semester, my students were calling it "When Bad Books Are Written by Good People." Because they decide, man, this explanation doesn't work. Because he tries to argue from the book of Job that God's hands are tied. He wishes he could do something, but he can't. And my students are saying, the book of Job? What? That's not what it says. It's just the opposite of what it says.
Right.
Okay, well, whatever.
When bad books are written by good people. I got to remember that. It reminds me of Christopher Hitchens' line about everyone has a book in them, and in most cases, that's where it should stay.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, right, exactly.
It's too funny. All right, Bart, thanks for coming on, and good luck with the seminar. I will be logging on myself because I want to get the whole story here. So again, that's on December 5th from 9:30 in the morning to 4:30 in the afternoon Eastern Time. We'll provide the link below where you can sign up for it right now, today or tomorrow. You get the early bird special, and keep up the good work. Tell me when your book on Revelations is going to be out. Do you think another year or two?
It'll be about a year.
Let us know.
We'll
We'll bookend this conversation with that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I'd love to.